Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Gross, CEO of American Friends of Tel Aviv University. I'm pleased to welcome you today to our webinar, From Academia to Politics, Scholarly Impact and Public Policy, featuring member of Knesset, Professor Alon. The path between academia and politics is a two-way street, impacting many of the critical issues facing the world today, from climate change to fighting pandemics. Today, we will hear from Professor Tal, who is well regarded in both areas. Professor Tal was elected to the Knesset this past June. Prior to joining the new government, he was chair of the Department of Public Policy at Tel Aviv University. He has had an illustrious academic career, including teaching positions at numerous universities around the world, such as the Harvard School of Public Health, Stanford University Center for Conservation Biology, Tel Aviv University Law School, and Ben-Gurion University. Professor Tal is a leading environmentalist and was recently appointed to head a new subcommittee in the Knesset to address the impact of environment on public health. He has been named by Israel 21C as one of the 20 Israelis leading the way out of the climate crisis. He received Israel's Environment Ministry's Lifetime Achievement Award as a 48-year-old, making him the youngest person to date to receive the award. Professor Tal has been named as one of 5 environmental heroes in Israel by the ICE news site, one of the 100 influential Israelis by The Marker, and one of Israel's top 10 environmentalists by Israel 21C. Professor Tal has authored or co-authored 7 books and published over 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals. He is the founder of the Israel Forum for Population, Environment, and Society. We are grateful to him for taking time out of his very busy schedule to join us and give us a behind-the-scenes insight on some of the most pressing scientific and political issues facing our world today. Professor Tal holds a BA from the University of North Carolina, an LLB from Hebrew University, and master's and doctorate degrees from the Harvard University School of Public Health. Today, you will hear his unique insights into how scientists influence public policy and how politicians influence scientific research, especially when it comes to providing government funding. With that, I am pleased to welcome Professor Alon Tal.
Well, good evening to you all. And Jennifer, first of all, I want to thank you for all you do for Tel Aviv University. And before I get too much into the nitty-gritty of being a politician in Israel, I would just say that it is an honor to be here at American Friends of Tel Aviv University gathering. I have been affiliated with Tel Aviv University in different capacities for many, many years, and really find it to be one of those tremendous sources of pride for our country, both in terms of what we do in research at Tel Aviv University and how we reach out to students from all the different tribes of Israel, and of course are a model of an academic community. It is Hanukkah, so perhaps before I start talking about the Knesset, let's just say a word or two about this holiday, because I am actually speaking to you from Modi'in, yes, that same city where the Maccabees 2,132 years ago made it all happen in terms of those of us who celebrate Hanukkah. And it's an interesting holiday for those of us who live here. I always think about the Maccabees and try to, characterize them. There's sort of 4 things about the holiday that I always find to be meaningful, and I'm just going to walk through them, and then we'll talk a bit about politics, Israel, and academia. But I would say that the first thing we have to recognize when we think about the Maccabees and the lessons we can learn from them is the importance of security. That I am a fairly zealous proponent of peace and 2-state solutions and all this stuff like that, but I'm well aware that just like the Maccabees needed to have the sword by their side as they stood up to the tyranny of the Hellenistic hegemonistic regime of the time, so we need to have our sword ready, and only with that really strong military capability can we even dream of reaching accommodation with our neighbors. And I think that we now are facing a wonderful period of time for the first time. I think that I really feel like the Arab-Israel conflict, which was part of our country's history for the past 73 years, is essentially done with the Abraham Accords. Most of the countries that matter in the Middle East already are working peacefully with Israel. We still have a Palestinian conflict, but we certainly are doing better in the region, and that's because of our strength. The second issue I want to talk about the Maccabees is their idealism. They're willing to really put it all on the line for spiritual matters, and I think that's something that for those of us who live in Israel, we have to remember that even though we've become a much more prosperous country, really what matters is the spirit and the soul, and that we can certainly learn from the Maccabees. The third thing about the Maccabees is unity. We all know that as the song goes, who can retell, and in the Hebrew, mi yamalel, that it was the ability to bring the whole nation together, which allowed us to have the collective strength. And when I think about the new government, and I'm not going to try to be excessively political, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say how proud I am to be part of a government which involves both right-wing and left-wing parties in Israel, really across the Israeli spectrum, because I'm a member of the Blue and White Party, which is a straight center party. And I always say, people say, what's your ideology? And I said, we're the one party that refuses to forget that what unites Israelis dwarfs what divides us. And that's something which we tend to forget. I think the United States suffers from the same kind of polarism, which is just so unfortunate. And I think that we're in a new age. And the fourth and final thing, which is most important, which leads me to my talk, is the Maccabees and the miracle of Hanukkah is indeed a early expression of the very, very importance of energy, conservation, and renewable energy. Just think about how few emissions came off from that one little can of oil over 8 days. And when we think about a planet which is really facing existential challenges in terms of the global warming, we have to look to Hanukkah as that early Jewish expression of the importance of making do more with less, and how energy and light can come from very, very small and miraculous sources. So that's my Hanukkah pitch for this evening. And now let's talk for a few minutes about politics. Israel is the land of miracles. Hanukkah is the holiday of miracles. And so when I was elected into Knesset, the right-wing newspaper, the Yisrael Hayom, which is somewhat dismissive of people who are in my party, said, oh, Alon, he's run for Knesset 5 times. And I said, fake news, because I ran for Knesset 7 times. This is something I always dreamed of doing. As you can hear from my accent, I grew up in the United States. And I really, I think as a child in North Carolina, it was always clear to me, I was president of my high school class, and it was clear to me that I really should be a congressman. That was my destiny. But I somewhere along the line got swept away in the zeal of Zionism and the great dream of bringing back the third Jewish Commonwealth. And so I found myself in Israel, but I never lost that dream of being an elected official and serving the people and trying to make the better place. So although for many years I worked in making better public policy by doing research and running environmental organizations, but I really realized that you do have a glass ceiling. And so I tried in several different areas. And when Benny Gantz, who used to be the chief of staff of the Israeli army formed a new party, I was thrilled, because when I moved to Israel, when I was quite young, he was my company commander when I was in the paratroopers. And he had a tremendous influence on me. I admired him greatly, as he was the youngest company commander in the history of the paratroopers. And we were a group of immigrants who had come over from different countries. Some of them were, how to put it, idiosyncratic, a little bit, I wouldn't say they were losers, but there were certainly people who were surprised to find themselves in the paratroopers. And he decided we were all going to jump out of airplanes and do what it took to become a paratrooper. And we all got through because of his personal attention. And I never forgot it. So when he started the party, I joined the ranks. And 4 elections later, here it is. I woke up one day and found myself to be a member of Knesset, something I'd always dreamed of. And here's the really surprising thing. Being a member of Israel's parliament is a whole lot better than I thought it would be. And I thought it would be amazing. There's a lot of things which are really special about this present government. In Judaism, we talk about something called Et Ratzon. That's when sort of the stars all line up together, and we feel like there's a holy moment. We have this opportunity that the Almighty has provided for us. And I kind of feel like that's where Israel's right now. And that is true for many reasons with this government of change. Let's start with the fact that we have a government with a lot of very new and interesting members of parliament. We have the so-called Norwegian Law in Israel. I spent my whole life in Israel. I thought I was some sort of American Israeli. And then I got in the Knesset and I found I'm Scandinavian. What I mean by that, the Norwegian law allows a member of parliament from a party who's in the government to resign and become a minister, and allows the people who are low on the list to come up. And if they change their mind, they can come back. So it encourages people to leave the parliament. And this is an important new law, I believe. Certainly, in the great Israeli of shameless opportunism, I think it's a fantastic law, but it allows me to get in. But I think it also brought in a whole new, about 21 or 2 of us, we all came in with careers. In fact, my good friend Yossi Shane, another professor from Tel Aviv University, when I was head of public policy, he was head of political science, and he's with the Israel Beitena party of Avigdor Lieberman. He's a brilliant scholar. And we both are having a grand old time because it's such fantastic people around us. I had always been told there's no such thing as friendships in politics. It's all about interests. And that simply isn't true in this government. And I think it has something to do with the fact that we're all in parties which are a little less than democratic. I mean, I think 1 or 2 parties have something similar to a primaries, but basically most of these lists get picked because these people are good team players, have done something important in their life, and were considered to be political assets. And so I find myself surrounded by really good people, about 50% women, which is, I think we have now the highest percentage of women ever in Israel's parliament, and we know that's good. And really people came to work, because when you have a new parliament where people don't have to be ministers, then all we do is come and work. And I'm talking about 16, 17-hour days, day in, day out, 6 days a week. And but it's so rewarding and so fascinating that I don't think any of us regret it. And we're thrilled to be as part of this government of change, like I said. Now, the other thing that's unique about this government, which makes it wonderful to come as an academic who spent his academic career working on issues of sustainability and environmental policy, is this is by far the greenest government and the greenest parliament that Israel's ever seen. I mean, I came in and I have some background experience. Jennifer was a little bit, I think, long-winded in her listing credentials, but I have done a few things for Israel's environment. And then I got there and I found out that not only am I committed to the environment, but every single party in our coalition, the government coalition has 7 parties. There was at least one champion there who came to the Knesset with the intention of making the environment better. And immediately I created a WhatsApp group and we started meeting. We called the Green Legislators, and we divided out the work, and we are truly working together to change things. And the first time we've seen a change in this government is the issue of climate change. Up until literally 5 months ago, Israel's climate change policy was anemic. That's being a little bit generous, but let's stick with anemic as opposed to pitiful. You could use either adjective as you will, but we really did not do what needed to be done. At a time when the scientists were saying that the planet Earth is starting to cook and we all have to cut back on our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50%, Israel's commitments at the Paris Climate Accord in 2015 were very, very, very modest, so much so that in fact, emissions continue to rise because the way we defined the emission targets were as per capita emissions, and per capita means as the population rises, you can produce more pollution. That's exactly what we're doing. That changed with this government. We have a commitment in place, and God bless Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. He's not from my party, but he had the temerity to get up and say, okay, we are going to join that elite club of countries that commits by the year 2050 to have no net carbon emissions. This is huge from a country whose carbon footprint is quite large. So we are starting to get with the program, and that's so important because I want us to think about this. I was always, as an environmental advocate, very critical of the government. I said, you know, the planet Earth is sick. And in the Army, when we go, we have somebody who's injured or sick, we throw them on a stretcher and everybody's expected to get under the stretcher. And whenever there's that one person, the ne'er-do-well or the, that doesn't want to come in and do their part, we look at them as sort of, a sociomatic kind of personality. And then when the world got together and put the planet Earth on that proverbial stretcher and the state of Israel wasn't coming in, it seemed to me outrageous. How could it be that the Jewish state, in the one most critical ecological challenge of our age, wasn't doing our part? So the good news is we are starting to do our part. We can do a lot more. I mean, let's compare it. Israel's committed itself to 30% renewables by the year 2030. Joe Biden's going 100% by 2035, but it's a whole lot better than the 6% renewables that we have today. And that is true for a lot of other areas. So I have a lot to say about Israel's climate policy, and you could argue that we could do more, but that's the half empty part of the glass. but there is a glass that is half filled now. And we went to Glasgow and Israel started to get with the program. Very, very proud of that. The other thing that happened was interesting for me environmentally, and they talk about, Jennifer asked me to talk a little about this sort of interface between being an academic and being a politician. Well, when you, as an academic who teaches environmental policy, you can't get enough of that issue of Pigovian taxes. What is Pigovian taxes? Arthur Pigo, the great economist from Cambridge University, who had the startling observation that it makes a lot more sense to put taxes on bad things than good things. For example, what's a good thing? Labor. Why do we put high income tax? We want people to work. Wouldn't it make sense to put things on bad activities, what they call sin taxes? And that's the idea, of course, behind things like taxes on cigarettes or alcohol and the like. Well, Israeli government, which didn't have any of this kind of stuff, under this new regime, we passed the budget and 43 laws came with it, and major reforms, including a tax on disposable plates and silverware and cups, taxes on, it's going to be coming in, what we call congestion fees. When you drive into Tel Aviv during rush hour, you're going to pay lots of money because we want to free up the road and move you into some sort of a more sustainable public transport option. We're putting a tax on carbon and on Coca-Cola and sugar drinks. This is a wonderful policy because I don't think that anybody needs to have regulatory harassment, but we should be creating real signals for people to do the right thing. So I'm really thrilled as somebody who taught all these years, and the students would roll their eyeballs, I'm certain, say, my gosh, this guy's waxing ecstatic about environmental taxes, but who's ever going to do this? Well, Israel's doing it now. It's now a new law, and it's been an honor to raise my hand and honor those laws and really bring some of these ideas together. And the most exciting thing is really literally a week ago, I am a member of the health committee in Israel, which is headed by a member of another party, Idit Silman. She's an Orthodox woman from the Yamina party. And we became the best of friends. That is the best thing about being in this coalition, by the way, because each side of the political map has been demonizing each other for so long. We forgot to stop and notice if any of these stereotypes are true. And they're not. My best friends, in terms of going out and having a beer or a cup of coffee, are on the right wing. And who would have thought? Because I'm not from the right wing, but I recognize that they have important things to listen to. And became great friends with Edith. And she said, it's wrong that you have a PhD in public health and the environment, and I'm head of the health committee, and you're not doing anything environment health. Let's make a subcommittee. And that's not done when somebody from another party empowers a political rival and gives them a subcommittee. But she did it. And I have a long list of issues from indoor air pollution to cellular antennas and the new generation that's going to have in drinking water and all sorts of issues, including climate change impact on human health, which we are going to be discussing and holding the executive branch's feet to the fire. And I'm going to sort of tone it down. I was told to talk for 15 minutes, and I'll try to be a disciplined speaker, but I just will say this. We all know from theory that parliaments or the legislative branch have two major functions. One, legislation, but the other one is a checks and balance, supervising and monitoring the executive branch to make sure that they don't exceed their powers and they meet their responsibilities. And I'm very, very glad to be able to be in that committee. I will hold the government's feet to the fire to the extent that I can, while at the same time, I'm really excited about these new laws, which maybe in the Q&A we can get to. I'll be writing a new forest law. I've written a new forest law, which I'm trying to work through the different ministries, because Israel's present forest law was written in 1925 by the British mandate. So after 100 years, I reckon that it's time to let that law go into its new assisted living and retire, and let's bring something new and modern that has biodiversity in there and fire prevention and carbon sequestration, all the modern things. And as somebody who was 12 years on the board of the Jewish International Board of Jewish National Fund, I oversaw forestry. It is time, and this is the time to do it. Like I said, it's et ratzon. It's the stars have lined up. And I've got another law on monitoring biodiversity and ecological corridors. There's so much we can do. There's so much this country needs, and now's the time to do it. So that's my opening pitch, and perhaps we can do some Q&A now, Jennifer, if the time is right.
Absolutely. Let's jump right in. Thank you so much. It's great to hear your passion and your excitement on behalf of the environment and in Israel. Just to give our viewers a little bit more background. You were, as you mentioned, you are not a native born Sabra. You were born and raised in North Carolina and made Aliyah in the 80s after you graduated from the University of North Carolina. Did your interest in the environment and in Israel start in the US or once you made Aliyah?
That is an excellent question. I often ask myself, where did this obsession come from? And I'd like to say that I was a second generation environmentalist. My father, when growing up, he was in charge of the laboratories for the US EPA in air quality and water quality, which are based in Research Triangle, North Carolina. And I remember, dinner time conversations, he'd come home and say, oh, there's 800% greater incidence of bladder cancer in New Orleans. We know it's because of the water of the Mississippi. And they sent me 200 samples and they expect me to find the toxic substances. So I guess something kind of got through to me of that, and just living in a state that was 60% forested and spending a lot of time hiking in the youth movement. But I didn't ever consider myself a hardcore environmentalist. When I got to Israel, I came after high school when I was 17. And then I came back after another couple of years later when I was 20 after UNC. I was thinking, what could be a unique contribution of an American Israeli? And at the time, environmentalism in Israel was in a very, very nascent, undeveloped state. And I felt like there was something about the great Green Revolution, which took place in the 1960s and 70s when Richard Nixon established the US EPA and America got with all these new legislations and really started cleaning up, and it hadn't come to Israel yet. And I felt like this might be a life's mission, and it was the luckiest decision ever made. I always feel, Jennifer, that the little decisions in life are very hard for me. I can't decide if I should have a Mars bar or a Milky Way. But if I should marry my wife or if I should get a PhD in environmental science, that was all obvious to me. And somebody, maybe I had an angel leading me on, but yeah, that was a very clear decision.
I think the answer is always a chocolate chip cookie over Mars or a Milky Way, for sure.
A soft one.
Uh-huh. Exactly, definitely soft one. Okay, so you ended up sort of right place, right time, and it's taken a while for Israel to embrace in these sort of, climate accords and really looking at clean energy and looking at the environment. Why now? Why do you think things are more open now? Why is there a better opportunity than there was previously?
Well, first of all, the international environment has changed. I think that the Biden administration came in and reminded the world that, yes, the climate crisis is very, very real. Incidentally, even when the US pulled out of the Paris Accords, Israel did not. And although it's very rare as a politician that I should say something nice about Benjamin Netanyahu, I'll go ahead and do so, but he stuck with the climate program, and his energy minister, Dr. Yuval Steinitz, who's a good friend, also is a Tel Aviv University PhD, by the way, that Dr. Yuval Steinitz stuck with the program. But I think the real reason why is that climate change is no longer the gloomy projections of Al Gore. It is a terrifying new reality for us in Israel. Israel is what we call a hotspot for climate impacts. For example, if the world's average temperatures have now increased by 1.1 degrees centigrade, we know that in Israel, and that's in the last 100 years in Israel, in the last 40 years in Tel Aviv, for example, average temperatures have gone up by 2 degrees every decade, half a degree. So it's going up twice as fast. Same is true of the rise in sea level. The Mediterranean Sea was gone up somewhere around 10 millimeters in the last several decades, where the world has only gone about 3. So we know that there's a lot of things happening here, and unfortunately, it's manifested in some new weather patterns. For example, the extreme weather events. The Alon highway, which runs right through Tel Aviv and right up to the Tel Aviv University campus, and the train station there is flooded every year, even though it was designed for 100-year floods. And indeed, a couple of years ago, 2 young people in southern Tel Aviv got trapped in an elevator and drowned. So we know that the kind of things like Hurricane Sandy, these are events that are happening more in Israel. Frequency of forest fires, it's now an annual event. So yes, the weather is changing, and so people have started to get it. But the real reason why, and this is the key, is that the younger generation, I'm talking about kids in their 15, 16, 17-year-olds, have all of a sudden smelled the coffee or the future that awaits them and are demanding that the grown-ups do better. I don't think since the Vietnam War, we've seen young people so passionate about issue and really pushing the establishment and older folks like me and saying we need to do more. This Greta Thunberg, who's an amazing young woman from Sweden, has inspired Israelis, and we have our own Strike for the Future group here. Hundreds of thousands of kids, they prowl the Knesset looking for people like me and saying, why aren't you doing more? And they're right, because it's their future that's at stake. It's our children, our grandchildren, and we are stealing their future. And there's nothing more egregious than stealing from a child. So I think that's the real thing. The younger generation is really stepping up to the plate, and hopefully we in the more senior generation will be worthy of their expectations.
You brought up a good point, and intergenerationally, people now are concerned about the climate and also sort of health, water, access to clean water, clean air, sort of this whole global collective future that we have on this planet and that we have to manage on this planet. Can you talk about that, sort of about this whole kind of global interaction of these forces, pollution and climate change and control?
Well, surely what climate change has reminded us is that we can no longer assume that if we are good citizens and good actors, everything's going to be okay. The atmosphere doesn't care whether the emissions come from Israel or China or Africa. And so when we think about a global strategy, we have to recognize that there are very poor countries that, first of all, historically contributed relatively little to the global emissions, but they won't have the resources to make the leap into the sustainable technologies we need. And that's why in Paris, the governments of the world agreed to make $100 billion climate fund to assist. Now, that's not enough money, even not nearly enough money, but at least it's something to start with. And I think that we have to recognize that, and that's true in general about the environment. Just last week, Israel signed a magnificent agreement, and then Friends of Tel Aviv University should be all over this, because some of the ideas came out of work that I did and other people at the university. But the notion is that the agreement for the first time creates what we call water energy nexus. So there's going to be solar fields in Jordan. What is the problem that Israel has in its solar? We have a very small country, and we don't have the land that we need to produce the kind of clean energy we want. What is the Jordanians' problem? They're dying of thirst. It's the most water scarce country in the world. They just took in 2 million refugees from Syria, and each one of them has a water footprint, so they don't have enough water. But we have the best and least expensive, most efficient desalination technology in the world. So we should be taking the water from the Mediterranean and sending it to Jordan, helping them out. The trouble is that has amazing carbon footprint. It's an energy intensive process. But if Jordan, which is 3 times the size of Israel, can use its real estate holdings to produce the electricity and we can import it, it's win, 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 win. And mostly winning is the planet. But I think it's very important that for the first time, Israel is willing to import energy and put itself dependent on one of its neighbors. Up until now, we've been what's called an energy island. And so this is very important. It gives me hope, because I think to the extent that the Jordanians' drinking water is dependent on Israeli cooperation and our electricity is dependent on Jordanian cooperation, maybe our kids will have a hope of getting beyond the kind of suspicions and enmity of so characterize the regions. And there's no easier and more obvious place to cooperate than the environment. So that's kind of regional and global thinking we need to talk about, because if anybody thinks, oh, I'll just put up a fence and I'll be here and I'll be fine, it doesn't work like that. Aquifers don't know any boundaries. Birds don't know boundaries. Nature doesn't know boundaries. We've got to be in this together, and there's no reason we shouldn't be in it together.
So it sounds like, in terms of regional cooperation, do you think that the Abraham Accords will open new opportunities for, clearly there has been with trade and in some areas, do you think in terms of climate, there'll be some opportunities there?
Yeah, in fact, I was remiss in describing it, because who's got the economic muscle to build those giant solar fields? Of course, it's the United Arab Emirates. It's the Emiratim, as we call them. And so it's great for me to see them realizing that their fossil fuel economy, its days are numbered. We have to get the world off of its addiction to fossil fuels if we want to have any kind of opportunity or hope of getting beyond the climate chaos which awaits us. So they are starting to really become leaders in solar energy and want this project to do. So it's really a tri-party agreement, and I think maybe that makes it easier for the Jordanians, but I'm so glad to see that. Now, there's also perils. Let's be honest. There's a company in the United Arab Emirates that wants to bring 70 oil tankers to the Gulf of Eilat and bring all their oil here. And those of us green legislators have been working with civil society to stop it. And we have a magnificent Minister of Environment. She's not from my party, but she is getting the job done. Her name is Tamar Zandberg, a young woman. And she has come out very strong against that, saying there's going to be the environmental risks associated with bringing that much crude oil to the Gulf of Aqaba, the Gulf of Eilat, and all the fantastic corals of, that if there should be one spill, this city of Eilat, which 85% of whose economy relies on tourism, would be decimated. So we are trying to stop that. And that's also a product of Israeli, United Arab Abraham Accord. So there's could be both ways, but the overall preponderance is good, and it's fantastic that we have now this new friend in the region who is moderate, smart, tolerant, and really wants to make peace with Israel. It's fantastic.
New dawn of a new day.
Indeed.
When we talk about climate legislation here in the US, it's very political. And so here you are, and this is a passion of yours. How do you think about sort of crafting legislation that is going to be able to pass, and that you're not just going to, not just an idea, but actually you're going to be able to execute, given industry interest and, municipal interests that aren't not necessarily always aligned with climate interests?
Well, that's a really good question. I want to make some distinctions between the politics of environmental legislation in Israel as opposed to the US. It's very political in Israel, it's very political in the US, but it's different. When I was in graduate school at Harvard, I worked at the US EPA. Okay, at the time, George Bush, W. Bush, the father, was the president, and he had Lee Thomas was the administrator of EPA, and it was fantastic. It was a Republican administration, but they were completely all in with an environmental agenda. And then I returned to the States intermittently, but let's say I was Rip Van Winkle, went to sleep for 25 years, and I came back, I would be appalled to find out that the environment has become a polarized issue, with Republicans lining up to some extent being suspicious of it and Democrat against. I don't want to get into the politics of why that happened, but I will say in Israel, that did not happen. Some of the best ministers of the environment we've had are on the right, not necessarily. I said we're all working together on this issue. But having said that, there's still a lot of people who aren't as enthusiastic as me. And to get legislation passed in Israel, I need to have the ministries on board, because if a minister decides to blackball or veto some of my legislative proposals, it's going to be very hard to pass it, because our coalition is shaky. Remember, it's 6159. In Hebrew, we say kol mamzer melech. Every bastard is a king. So anybody can bring down the government, and we're trying very hard not to rock the boat and work in consensus. And so I need to convince them that this works. And if that doesn't work, my boss is the Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz, and he wields a bit of influence, and sometimes he can twist an arm or two, but we have to do it together. But I think that's a model for the way the country needs to start working, because there are so many issues that Israel has become so divided about, and we need to start thinking, realizing that we need to be unified with so many from Iran and climate change. And there's just so many common challenges that we need to do. And this is the Hanukkah time. We talk about being unity and for the greater good. And I think that hopefully these will be years of healing, when 10 years when the country became more and more divided and cantankerous, and the political debate was so acrimonious here, we can start healing. I hope so.
Speaking of unity, and alignment, is there an opportunity for Israel to work with, sort of the superpowers on these issues, like with the US, with China? Is there opportunity for real global cooperation, not just regional?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that Israel has certain things to offer. And actually, Tel Aviv University is a tremendous platform for this kind of thing. There is invariably opportunities. They'll say, we have a special seed grant program if you want to work. I did something with the University of Maryland, but with, they have had Columbia. All these universities come together with Tel Aviv University, presumably with the help of philanthropic help through the American Friends, in other words, to create the kind of cooperative ventures, because Israel is in many ways fascinating. I'll just give you one example. Take climate change, okay? Israel is a country the size of New Jersey, but it has, at least 6 different climatic zones. And so when we look at the hyper-arid zones of the South and the rapid changes in rainfall patterns, this could be something which could give great insights about how we can all adapt to climate change, or what we're doing with desalination or drip irrigation, or Israel's work in forestry. We plant trees in ways that nobody else can. So I am constantly in touch with colleagues abroad, taking advice, giving advice. And I think that on these issues, there's certainly the case. And you can just look at the number of joint papers and grants which is Tel Aviv University faculty have with colleagues in the States and around the world to see that there is, in this age of the internet, there's really, and now with Zoom, it's so easy to communicate. It broadens the playing field dramatically for academia and for, I think, for governments as well.
How Zoom has certainly changed our lives in dramatic ways and absolutely made facilitation like that so much easier to pull people together from all around the world. Talk to us a little bit about the role of academia, especially research universities, such as Tel Aviv University, play in the public discourse about climate change and public health, and how much are research universities and the research they're putting out interfacing with government officials?
Well, I certainly see myself as something of an emissary, somebody who can bring the insights and expertise and imperative know-how of academia to the committee halls and discussions of the policy areas. And in my new committee, I'm already in touch with top academics from Tel Aviv, but all the universities. I think we have a unique, since I'm in the environment, I would like to make a shout out here for the Porter School for the Environment, which has established pretty much an unprecedented climate change center. Professor Colin Price, who heads that esteemed institution, is a good friend and is on the IPCC. For those of you the uninitiated, that's the International Panel for Climate Change, those scientists who advise the UN about what a climate strategy could be. So he is a top level climate expert, and he's brought his passion to it. And Tel Aviv University, the president first was learning about it, but he has moved up the learning curve very quickly. There's a new policy for trying to make the campus carbon neutral with renew it with solar panels. And I'm really excited about this. Always Tel Aviv University was the nation's leading campus in terms of ecology and nature preservation. And our biology department is certainly the best in the country. But I think in this area of climate change as well, this is some place where we've moved forward. And the government needs this kind of expertise, because although there's a lot of young, talented people in government, they don't have the depth of knowledge, the international experience, and the know-how. So yes, it's very, very important. And I know that Yossi Shane, the other Tel Aviv professor, there's only two professors in the Knesset right now, and they're both from Tel Aviv. So, but he also feels the same way, that we really need to do more to bring these two communities together for the common good.
That's wonderful to hear. And I think you don't have to look too far in Israeli society, whether it's in politics or in the private sector, to find esteemed graduates of Tel Aviv University.
They're everywhere. And my public policy, it seems like half of the legislative aides at the Tel Aviv are either former students or I took your course, and I said, oh yeah, I try to remember who they are. But yes, we are very, very networked. It's great.
We love to hear that. And Professor Colin Price, early on, we started a series of webinars in March of 2020 when the pandemic really broke, and we all, certainly in the US, were kind of homebound, and we had him speak about climate crisis and COVID. So he's an expert that those of you who are tuning in will remember. We heard from Colin early on in the crisis. For those of us who are concerned individuals, is there anything that we can do to contribute to or to influence effective government action when it comes to these important, scientific issues, these climate change issues? Do you have any recommendations?
Well, there's personal activities and personal behavior, and then there's giving wisely. So I'll say just a word or two about that. First of all, 20% of the global emissions come from beef. So if you can eat a little bit less meat or have your Impossible Burger instead of another hamburger, that's good for the planet. And one of the things we're doing in Israel, which I think is going to be amazing, is getting this cultured meat. I hope the next 5-6 years we'll start seeing most of the animals we eat will be actually synthesized in laboratories. And the big kosher question is, will it be milchik, or will it be fleshik or not? Maybe it's part of it, it didn't come from an animal. But I think food technology is very, very important to the future of the planet and researching it, because people aren't going to give up meat. I know that, some of us feel very virtuous, we're vegetarians, but most people, certainly not in China, and they're not going to become vegetarians. But if we can give a technological alternative, which talks about the real significance of the science. Bill Gates came out with a wonderful book called Avoiding a Climate Disaster. And he talks about a range of areas where technologies are going to be critical for overcoming it. And I think that, so when you talk about supporting an academic institution, there are really very, very promising things in the engineering department. And you can, but that's certainly some way helping with the technology. And then we could all, when you get on the plane to come to Israel, and you should come to Israel as soon as possible. And we had a little setback this week with the new variant, but I believe I'm sitting on the health committee and the education committee. The health committee, it seems to me that it's not quite as terrifying as people thought it was, and we're going to open our skies once again. So plant a few trees when you get on the plane. It's called offsetting, so that you don't have any net carbon contribution. Find ways to really try to lower your personal one, because we all have to be in this together and make our best effort.
Well, on that uplifting note, I know for our viewers who usually turn into our regular webinars, we usually go an hour, but I know you have important business in the Knesset, so we do not want to keep you. Professor Tal, we thank you for being so generous with your time and sharing your thoughts and your passion about the climate and the environment, and even some suggestions for us as to what we can do, and we certainly appreciate that. Thank
Jennifer,
you.
Can I just have a last word before you thank me? I want to really say a word or two to the participants and those people who have the patience to sit through 45 minutes of political drivel. Look, Israel has serious challenges. The planet has serious challenges. It's not going to be possible to win this battle if we leave this as a spectator sport. We need players. And by being engaged in Tel Aviv University, which is a university not only with tremendous competence and innovation, but with a real sense of values to try to make the world a better place, you are being a player. And I know that sounds like rhetoric, but it's true. And as somebody who's still only on leave as an academic, I look forward to returning to that austere community and being part of that contribution to making Israel and the world a better place. So I want to thank you for allowing us to do that, because there's so many competing good causes in other universities. And by sticking with Tel Aviv University, I think you've made a right choice, and I hope we're worthy of your support.
And we certainly appreciate that and agree with you. We feel there are incredible things coming out of the university, and we hope that through this series of webinars, we're educating our audience and letting them know about the amazing things from all different disciplines. And so we really appreciate you acknowledging that. We'd like to thank all of our friends from across the country who have tuned in and from around the world for taking the time to join us for this webinar. If you would like to rewatch the webinar, you will find a copy posted in our webinar library on AFTAU's website. And with that, wishing everyone a happy Hanukkah. May the lights of the menorah bring light and peace into your home. Chag Sameach, everybody.
Good night.